We're getting started, guys. Thank you much for being here. My name's Dennis Neal. I'll be your moderator. Now, I know it's day 3, and we're all emotionally drained. And so what I promise you is that this panel will be painless and fun, and so let's get it started. So I look at every panel as kind of a play, actors in a play. And the cool play that the Milken folks have assembled for us here today is we've got, as we talk about privacy and technology, we've got a privacy crusader, okay, with us. And yet, on the other hand, we've got a super cyber sleuth who worries more about America coming under attack and Americans being hurt than he does about any loss of privacy. Then we've also got a technologist who's with a huge chip maker and therefore kind of sees the commercial aspects that can sometimes come in and kind of curb invasions of privacy. Yet we've got a computer scientist, not linked to a company, who knows what technology really can do. So those are our 4 actors. Now let's introduce them. So to my immediate right, we have Susan Herman. She is president of the American Civil Liberties Union. That means she would be the privacy crusader and also a professor at the Brooklyn Law School. Then we've got, hang on here because I mess up names, we've got Stan Stahl. Stan is the Chief Information Security Officer of Standard Clouds. He's also president of the LA chapter of the cyber sleuth group, the ISSA. So we're going to be pitting these two against each other and see if we can get them to fight a little bit. And then next to Stan, we've got Susan Graham. She's a distinguished professor of electrical engineering at Berkeley, and she is the computer scientist. And then we've got the Intel Vice President Chief Privacy Officer, if there even is any such thing inside a tech company. We've got Michelle Finnerman-Dennedy. Thank you for being with us. And let's just start with kind of an overarching question. Everyone talks about the right to privacy, but I think the bigger question now is there any privacy left at all? Start us off, Susan of the ACLU.
Okay, well, I would start by saying we have a lot less privacy as against the government, which is the ACLU's chief concern, than we did before 9/11. I could mention the name Edward Snowden, which I'm sure you've heard of, but I want to show you a very nice wonky side about the government's surveillance program. If you'll give me slide number 3, whoever is in charge here. Okay, can you read that? The guys sitting around the table, obviously the NSA, are saying, get me everything on everybody.
As PowerPoint slides go, I'd say that's a good choice.
Okay, so, and if you also give us slide number 4, I think that's also a nice one. Can you see at the top, it says, yes, we scan. Okay, so what the government is doing is they've laid out these dragnets and they're just collecting, shorthand, everything on everybody. And so we have a lot less privacy than we used to. A whole different conversation about the extent to which the private sector is having information about you is a similar issue. But I think we really need to worry about our privacy as against the government. And the last major conference that I was at last month was the Brussels Forum, run by the German Marshall Fund. And they had a panel on why should I care what the government knows about me if I'm not doing anything wrong. And let me tell you, the people who really truly got it in that room were the Germans who remembered the Stasi. So I think that one thing that I want to separate out is this whole issue of government surveillance as opposed to what does Amazon or Google or anybody else know about me, because I think they're very different issues.
Okay.
And my chief goal today is to have you walk away with answers to the question, why should I care?
Okay, but Stan, come to think of it, if I'm not doing anything wrong, why should I care? And do you think we have any privacy left?
Well, first of all, I really question whether we've ever had any privacy at any time in civilization. Yes, if you wanted to be a hermit, go somewhere, and in today's world, that's stay off the grid. It's the corresponding kind of thing. First, I agree with Susan, absolutely.
Not allowed.
I'm sorry.
Agreement.
Nope, I must, because in terms of a right to privacy, if you think back to, the whole idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, how can we have any of those without privacy? Privacy is kind of built in as a requirement to those. But at the same time, part of the function of the government, as I remember the preamble to the Constitution, is to provide for the national defense. And we're in a situation you can't ignore, whether it's terrorists, whether it's cyber criminals, any of those. And I think part of the key point, and I think part of why I'm grateful for the panel, for the opportunity to be here, is part of my message. I think we're at a stage in history where what we have to do is, first of all, have the dialogue like we're having right now. And secondly, we also need the opportunity, yes, people to lobby in Washington and really strongly, I commend what the American Civil Liberties Union does and has done over the course of my lifetime. But we also need technology that puts the measure of privacy in the hands of the people, because ultimately it's each one of us that have to decide what do we want private, what don't we want private, what do we want, what are we willing to accept the government collecting, what are
Okay.
we willing to accept from Amazon, and all of that. I'm from the 60s where the mantra was power to the people.
And
I
yet-
think that's what we've got to do.
And yet I would bet that the vast majority of the billion people on Facebook have rarely ever bothered to go in and like fix and change their privacy. I mean, just because you give us the tools to do it doesn't mean most of us will do it. So now Susan Graham, our computer scientist, these two are just entirely wrong, aren't they?
So-
Because with the technology, there is no privacy at all.
No, I don't think they're wrong, but I think where there's some confusion here. First of all, we haven't said what we mean by privacy. We use the word, we know it when we see it, we don't agree. If you get a group of people in the room and look at instances, one person's notion of privacy is different from another's. And in addition, privacy is contextual. There are things you tell your doctor that you really want your doctor to know. You don't tell those things to your casual friends. There are things you'll tell a salesperson about your body that you won't tell your friends. And so when we think about how to deal with privacy, and particularly when we start to think about technological solutions, we need to be able to say at some level of another, here's what we're talking about. Here is what we're really trying to protect, and here are the things that may be personal, but it doesn't mean we hold them to ourselves. The second, I would disagree with what one of you said.
That's
maybe,
good.
Maybe Dennis.
That's not as good, but
That's good.
The-
That's best. Yeah.
The individual needs to be able to say in some way or another, here's my personal privacy policy. Here's what I want to protect. It's not then the individual's obligation alone to deal with the mechanisms for protecting it. So,
but
so let me give you an example. We get these forms on our screen saying, here's our privacy policy. Do you consent? If you consent, you can use this app, this service on your phone, and otherwise you can't. That puts the obligation to understand and to respond on the individual. I think the obligation is on the provider to make sure that they're conforming to what the users.
that's a
Wishes are.
perfect spin out to Michelle Dennedy, because speaking to commercial providers and Intel, biggest chip maker in the world that you're with, do the private companies in the commercial sector, do they have any ability to show restraint, and do they have any desire to have restraint?
So I'm going to be that commercial kind of sellout that I'm supposed to be playing this character and say,
Good.
we're very interested in money. $60 billion of it coming in the door. So we love money. What does that mean for privacy? Well, I tell you what I believe it means as a corporate privacy officer. Privacy is highly contextual. It's about human rights, but it also can be broken down into, and these components can be unwound at some length, and I won't do that. But the authorized, and that means who, what, where, why, who, and is it really the right person? Processing, everything, including sitting on stuff that's turned into like an ugly episode of Hoarders in our data center, of personally identifiable information, which has grown into categories of metadata and stuff that was never personalized in our history before. According to, and this is like where all the money is the fair information principles, which means that it has to be something that is moral, legal, ethical, and commercially sustainable. And if all of those parameters are met, A, we make a lot of money, B, we satisfy our customers, C, we fulfill human rights. So it's very buildable, and the one who does it will make a boatload of cash.
Okay, I'm going to stick with you for a quick follow-up, because I've covered technology in this area for many, many years, a couple decades or more. And I remember when the web was first rising, the thing that marketers said is, well, here's the thing. We might know that you've bought this at this place at this time, but we never have tied that information to your identity of where you live and who you are. And therefore, you still have privacy, because while we know your habits, we don't know it's you. That seems to have fallen away in recent years. And Michelle, it seems like now not only do they know my habits, but they know it's me. When did that fall away? And was there some industry decision that it's no longer evil to connect your exact personal name to the stuff we have on you? What happened there?
Well, so I think the technical ability, it turned into what I call the Lady Gaga bikini. Remember when Lady Gaga showed up in a meat bikini?
Yes.
Just because you can doesn't mean you should. Maybe momentarily, but that thing's going to go bad. Can you imagine the after party with Lady Gaga? Not so much. So we've gotten into this thing of, let's worship the new models in advertising. There's a lot of dollars here. Oh, that's great. The exciting thing for we humans is that we're actually quite boring. We're really kind of boring. So you can connect me and surveil me, but I will posit that it's going to be increasingly less commercially sustainable for you to even care.
To even bother.
To even bother.
But you, the
can have
commercial
bulk
company,
data.
or you, the end user?
The end user, I think, will care more and will have more interesting, creative, colorful ways to interact with their information economy.
Okay.
But
get
I think we'll get companies wanting to less
Okay.
spy and more succeed.
Let's get Susan, the ACLU president, back on this. Did you notice that somehow we crossed that chasm between tracking our habits and actually now knowing it's an exact person inside the home? And does it bother you?
I think we've noticed that a lot, and I think there's reason to be very concerned about that. One of the chief programs that Edward Snowden told everybody about was this whole program that involves the government scooping up everybody's metadata, all the telephone numbers you've been calling and the phone numbers that call you when, where, timing, et cetera. And a lot of people say, well, why should I care about metadata? And the government says all the time, this is not so bad, we're not listening to the contents of your conversation. Well, the ACLU promptly brought a lawsuit because we're a customer of Verizon Business Services. And who calls the ACLU? It's school kids who are concerned that their principals hate them because they're gay, or police officers who think they had an unfair disciplinary hearing, et cetera. So if the government data banks all have this information that Dennis called the ACLU on day number 1 and talked to me for 5 minutes, and the next day a staff attorney called him back and talked for an hour and a half, and then the staff attorney called the expert in XYZ, you can put together an entire story. And therefore, this whole idea that it's only metadata, we don't need to worry about it, is really just not the contemporary world anymore.
Okay.
So that's one very important fact that I think people need to know in evaluating the privacy laws.
But Stan,
Yes.
if I'm not calling a terrorist, should I care?
Well, so let me not go to that place, because I think the more relevant place for that question is, if we're tracking terrorists or cyber criminals, then absolutely we need to find a way to do that, because they're out there. They're real.
But the problem is our government does not take a spear
Yes.
gun and go kind of down underwater,
Right.
find the right fish and spear them. Our government's putting out a 5-mile gill net and collecting everything and then wondering if something shows up interesting. That doesn't seem like a very sophisticated way.
Well, it's not. We have to do a better job at
Susan?
it.
So,
Yeah.
so the issue isn't the collection. The issue is the use. If the data's there and nobody...
If they didn't collect it, they couldn't use it.
If they didn't collect it, they couldn't use it, but they could collect it and not use it. And we're not going to be able to stop the collection. The technical reality of this world is that the collection is going to happen.
Whether we wanted to
And-
or not.
And because there are tons of beneficial uses of the information, because information is collected as a side product of doing something else, it's going to be there. What we can do is control who gets access to the data and what they're allowed to do with it. And so if the government wants to know that a known bad guy talked to someone else, that may well be within the legitimate needs of our defense. That doesn't mean that they can find out that Dennis talked to Susan.
Let me disagree with that in part, since
That's
you're looking
good.
for disagreement. Okay, so I think I agree with a lot of what Susan is saying in terms of the private sector and the utility of information. But if you could give me slide number 5. Why should we care about the collection? I don't think it's only about the government's use, but if the government has access to information, that in and of itself does harm. So this
Why?
is
If it does nothing with it?
why. Here's why. This is the first attempt that I've seen to try to document how people react to the idea that the government knows all sorts of things about them. And this is PEN, P-E-N, the largest organization of writers and journalists in the world. This was a domestic survey that they did of their writers and authors, asking them a bunch of questions on a survey. Have you changed what you research, what websites you go to, what topics you're willing to research now that you know about all this government surveillance? 1 in 6 said yes. I have, in fact, I'm no longer researching the Middle East because I'm afraid I'm going to end up on a no-fly list. And about an addition, up to it gets up to 40% if you talk about the people who have thought about censoring themselves. And the next slide is an international standard. You can't really read all the figures, but it's
Yeah,
even more
please
in
don't.
many other countries. But yeah, I'm not going to read you all that. But the basic idea is that the mere fact that the government is collecting all this information changes who we are as a society. It's had an impact on freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion, because people don't like the idea that the government now knows all about us and we know very little about them.
Okay,
So-
but Michelle, it seems to me that the 1 in 6 journalists who have stopped reporting or searching because they worry about it, they're just self-important wimps. Because first of all, no government investigator even cares what a journalist is doing, and second of all, who says anyone's going to read what you write? And at least there's 5 out of 6 who aren't affected. What do you say?
Well, I think for every one person that would report on a survey like this, it's a pebble in a pond, right? So the chilling effect on democracy is absolutely dire, and it does spread out over time. I think the interesting thing about the whole government side of it is, and this is talking to a lot of these folks, is God, I wish they were as good at their jobs as we imagine that they were. And the reality is we have so much hoarded data that is completely irrelevant when you have that dragnet and you're looking for the one tuna fish and everything else is like,
Yes.
toxic waste and plastic bags that are discarded. By the time you get to the fish, it's gone off. That is what surveillance looks like today. We need to curate information. So whether or not we like or don't like that they're collecting it, yes, they're going to continue to collect it. And I don't think that should stop us from having a culture that says that's inappropriate. I don't think that stops us from having more transparency. We can build that in, and we can have due process. So when the technology discussion always comes up, I think it's fascinating because back in the days when the first privacy codes were being written, people were living in mud huts. Guess what you can do with a mud hut? You can look in the window. So they decided to have these codes and say, don't look at my wife naked. That's where technology and culture meet.
But Susan,
So-
go ahead.
Well, just the other side of this. The FBI says here in Los Angeles alone, $500,000 a week in online bank fraud occurs. All right, this is serious money, serious businesses, serious nonprofits that are losing this money. One of the things that we want to do, but we can't, and in part because of laws, is find ways. We collect a lot of information. How do we share that more effectively with law enforcement, with financial services firms, so that we can see the canaries in the coal mine and protect other banks from
Okay.
those kinds of losses as well.
Susan, our last 2 answers
Yeah.
were basically arguing for more ability to violate privacy of just some instead of violating privacy of all. It sounds like they want to get even better at it.
So they want to get better at getting certain information for certain purposes. Okay, that's not necessarily a privacy violation. I mean, I think Susan's right that there are dangers that come with collection. And what I said was collection is a fact of life, and we're not going to be able to put this genie back in the bottle. But that's not to say that we don't need to be concerned with the consequences of having all that data. And there are legitimate reasons, there are legitimate uses. The way we hope to cure diseases in this country is by looking at aggregates of very personal information about the consequences of having a disease and the consequences of particular medications and so on. And the violation of privacy is if you then come back and identify an individual and disclose that person's disease inappropriately. So inappropriately is you keep them from getting a job or you somehow go public with private information. So there is a privacy issue, but it's not about let's not have the data.
Okay, Susan.
And yesterday, just to pick up on your point, was a New York Times article on how particular kinds of medical research are being limited because now Medicare and Medicaid data is being stripped of some of the information that's in it that could go into those data sets and provide a lot more useful information.
Okay, Susan, so even if the 3 tech guys over here managed to get this right on the privacy and the balance and the tools and the da-da-da-da, we've still got cameras everywhere now. In New York, you're on camera an average of 16 times a day. With 1 billion or more cam phones out there, nobody can do anything without somebody somewhere seeing it. Are cameras an even bigger violation to privacy than a lot of the data tracking stuff?
I think they're just a different kind of privacy, because with facial recognition, there is a way that you can figure out that the particular person is, who they are. But I think in terms of what we're worried about, I think what you have to go back to is the potential for abuse, because people do point out, of course, that there's value to this, that if you can see a person who's committing a crime and stop them, or solve the crime, that's good. But the question is always not just what are the benefits of the technology, but what are the costs. So since you want humor on the panel, I will give you as an example of government abuse, not people who were put on the no-fly list or had their taxes investigated or who were arrested because the government saw what they were doing, but a study that was done in the UK where they have a whole lot of surveillance cameras every place. So somebody who was studying how they were using these surveillance cameras discovered that the cameras had the ability to pan and zoom, so that if the operators of the cameras saw something that was suspicious, they could zoom right in and see exactly what was happening with their cameras.
Guess what the boys wanted to look at?
Exactly. That's exactly the point,
Cleavage.
Michelle has guessed. 15% of the guys operating the cameras, in fact, used the cameras to look at female anatomy, and then they would print out pictures of their favorite pictures, and
There's
then
a
they would
whole
post
lot
them
of
on the
human
wall.
going on.
Okay, so now this is not what that technology is supposed to do. But the problem, as I was saying before, is that all of this government surveillance is going on behind closed doors, and we don't really know what they might be doing. So I think you can't just say this is a good thing because we know what we want it to be used for, without ignoring the history that there is always a potential for abuse. So all I'm saying, I'm not saying we never want surveillance or that it never does any good. I'm saying that I think the conversation we've been having since 9/11 is it's all benefits and no costs.
Yeah, and I want to dive in on this. So, if you think about from a risk perspective and a prioritization. So every policing force, whether there are secret surveillance people or people in their lovely uniforms here in the room, and I thank you for your service, sir, in seriousness. But it's interesting. So you look at Baltimore and you think about camera recognition. Who are the guys that we actually want to drag in? The young kids who are out there throwing rocks, who are dumb enough to leave their faces exposed and they're just idiots, or the guys who thought in advance, brought arms, covered their faces to hide. So from a societal perspective, who do I want the cops to go after? The dumbass kid, or the guy who really thought this through and tried to disrupt and harm our police forces so that they could not maintain the peace? And these are discussions we've not had with our ability to surveil. And I'll give you one other kind of interesting quip, which is, I did not know this until my trip to LA. But I came down on the plane and I had run out of, lotion on the day. So I just used baby oil on my legs.
Okay, where are we going with this?
Que no bueno. When you go through the naked scan, because I didn't get on the TSA checklist, and I went through the naked scan.
The naked scan, that's what that's called.
Well,
the
I
naked-
usually
okay.
get my little pat down from the TSA and have my little moment with them. But I was wearing a skirt, and so I thought I'm not going to do that one. I've had all sorts of interesting, we should combine services, gynecological and safety in one. So I walked through, and all of a sudden the thing lights up, and apparently, unbeknownst to me, baby oil is something that is picked up by the residents in the machine. And so from waist to toe, I was shining like a Christmas tree and very clearly wearing a skirt. So technology is one thing. Technology operated by stupid people, technology just accelerates stupid.
Susan Graham, I heard a panel yesterday where a guy talked about the camera was watching. The camera was smart enough because of the software. It sees a guy walk into this office. He sets down a briefcase. Guy walks out without briefcase. Camera alert security. They call a bomb squad. Bam! Fantastic. Briefcase was just a briefcase. Thank you for helping me recover the lost briefcase. Are cameras going too far if they start getting that smart?
People do that all the time. People are told in airports, if there's a bag left unattended, report it. So,
What's the difference?
I mean, I think there are issues with cameras, but historically, part of our loss of privacy was that there were people watching us. If you've ever read Jane Jacobs' book about cities, one of the things that made cities safe was that there were a lot of people looking out their windows, keeping track of their neighbors. So there's surveillance and there's surveillance.
Okay.
Now you're right that there are algorithms that aren't so good, that
Okay.
confuse.
All right. Stan, you take this next one for us. So late one night at midnight, CEO of a startup that I've been doing some consulting to calls me. He's got a hot tip. He knows that the government is hacking into his servers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He says the secret is Google. Google has a back door. It's cooperating with government. They can get anything they want. And I just thought, you're crazy. You've been up too late. So 3-4 days later, in the inside of the New York Times, small little story about government going after some terrorists. And buried in the story is a paragraph that says, now one thing they were going to do to this one terrorist guy is they were going to release results of his personal Google searches. And suddenly it occurred to me that, what you search for on Google, that is incredibly personal stuff a lot of times. Does Google turn out to be the single biggest threat to privacy we have? Because if you're searching for information on a terminal disease, you do not want that information to get out, that you worry about having a disease.
So I wouldn't say they're the most dangerous or whatever. I mean, I think we've got government up high on that list as well. But
Using Google.
But what Google's doing, and the other search engines as well, it's absolutely that they collect that information, they use it for their own marketing and selling purpose. I mean, they sell that information. And I mean, that's one of the things that makes me rather proud to be part of the company I'm with, that we're looking at how do we build solutions, how do we put the technology in the hands of the consumer so that the consumer can decide, hey, I'm about to do a search, but I don't want anybody to know about this search. I want this search to be kept private. It may be for anything from I'm a terrorist, in which case, hey, we might push back and say, I'm glad you can't. But it could also be a medical disease. It could be, I'm looking up places to have a surprise party for my wife, and I don't want her to know about this stuff. So
I'm thinking there's more private searches than that, okay?
Right. But the key is, we've got to put the power in the hands of people. That's part of the solution. It's not the only one, but part of it is people got to have the right to make those choices.
Anyone else want in on Google?
Yeah, I think I want in on Google because, first of all, in terms of the law, what the government has been scooping up in terms of information, the metadata that they've actually been collecting has been only through telephones. There were a couple of years where the government was using one of the Patriot Act powers to look at the internet addresses that people were visiting and the email to and from addresses. But they stopped doing that, I think, because they didn't think that people were going to go for it. Plus, a very interesting phenomenon about the whole private sector, Google and everybody else, is that at first, after 9/11, all the internet companies and telecoms they couldn't give the government all the information on their private users quickly enough. They thought it was patriotic. The government was saying, this is how we're going to keep America safe. Give us all the information. And they were doing it. No warrants. They were violating the law in some places in doing it. No concern about the privacy of their customers. Particularly since Edward Snowden's revelation, there has been a sea change in the sort of come to Jesus moment of the private companies concerned about the privacy of their users, because clearly they think there's going to be a pushback from the consumers, and that American hegemony over the internet is really being threatened. That if we don't protect the privacy of users on the internet and make it possible for people to protect their own privacy, Brazil and France and whoever else are going to start their own internets.
Okay.
So I think the concern in the private sector is, to me, not so much the Googles of the world, but the small startups that are under the radar.
Why?
Google has some reputational value to protect. If you're a small, invisible, anonymous company and you're going to make money by packaging data, then the whole value proposition is different. And one of the ways that those companies accumulate data is by what's called data fusion. They take data from seemingly unrelated sources, and by putting it together, they can infer information about individuals. It might not even be true, and they can sell that information.
But I used to tell my writers at Forbes, you got to show, not tell. So can you give us an example of a startup that's worrying you, that's doing this, literally, or do you just think it might happen someday?
No, I know they're out there. I don't.
You don't know which ones?
I can't tell you which ones.
Then you failed the show, not tell test. Michelle, do you have any?
I'm not going to name names,
Right.
but I do know several companies who are analytics company, and the way it works is if you leave your Wi-Fi on all the time and you just walk around,
As we all do.
as well, not all of us. Some of us care about our privacy. If you have gone into a coffee shop and signed on their terms and conditions, and I'm sure none of you have read them except for me, what often they say is we have these commercial relationships, yada yada, and what happens is with this data triangulation, you leave your Wi-Fi on, you have agreed to share. So you are spitting out information, whether or not you're in that Starbucks or, and I hate to keep calling
Long
out
after
a brand.
leaving.
Long after, well, no, when you're walking by, when you're proximate. So if you're walking down downtown San Jose or LA, and you hit a number of different places, so you've gone on the app to Neiman Marcus, and then you went and had a coffee afterwards. You're triangulating using that service. I think that kind of surreptitious scraping and packaging and selling, you're starting to see the VCs very interested in getting money for these companies, and they're not asking the questions
Right.
about, is this authorized processing according to FAIR principles of data?
So I was at a very interesting talk at Stanford yesterday morning, and this issue came up, and a cybersecurity researcher said, we discovered a very interesting thing. If you have a power meter on your phone, that's equivalent to having GPS. You can follow somebody because of the power fluctuations that have to do with how far you are from the cell tower and whether there are buildings in the way and so on. And so that's why I say the collection of information is something we can't cap. And the action, it's very nice that you turn off your phone. Turns out it isn't good enough.
Exactly.
Unless you turn it off
There's always a
to the
new-
point where you can't get a call, and then what are you carrying it around for?
If I could give you a counterexample, there was a person who, Nick Merrill, I can now say his name, who was he ran a small internet company in New York, and years ago he got a national security letter from the government demanding information about one of his clients, and he litigated for 6 years under the name of John Doe and wasn't allowed to tell anybody that he was the plaintiff in the lawsuit in order to protect his client's privacy.
How'd that work out?
Well, we won to some extent. There was this gag order which prohibited him from telling anybody that he had ever gotten any request, even if he didn't mention the name. So there were major First Amendment problems. But what Nick said to me, he said, I just thought that this was wrong. I feel like I'm a custodian of information, and unless the government has a court order, which they didn't. He said, if I thought they needed this, if they had a court order, one thing. But that leads me to a question. I'm a lawyer. We have a canon of ethics. Is there such a thing as professional ethical standards in the industry? Do people have a sense of that?
Yeah, because I want to go back to something. So Eddie Snowball did not make me care about privacy at all. I'm glad that it's made it public. The ACLU brought a case against AT&T 10 years ago. We've been begging journalists to come to Black Hat for 20 years. This is not a Snowden phenomenon within the privacy world. Do we have a codified ethical code yet? No, but we've been working on one for 10 years. My profession didn't even exist in 2000.
10 years you're working on one? That means you don't have one and you will never have one. In the internet, where things are changing hugely, every 3 to 6 months, to take 10 years to do anything is like building an LA freeway that is already clogged by the time it opens.
No, well, so when you want it to be going through all the channels and it goes through K Street and stuff, it takes time. That doesn't mean we don't live a life. So I'm not a lobbyist. I don't do a lot of that government stuff. I move on. But the code is, and we've written a book called The Privacy Engineer's Manifesto. The manifesto is our code of ethics. This is how we build. We go back to the OASIS standards that existed in the past. We use business diagrams, we use use cases, and we are transparent about how we build.
How many copies of that manifesto have you sold or distributed?
So I gave it away for free online, so you can get it on your Nook or Kindle or online. And so we sold, I think we pushed through over 10,000 copies in paper, over 50,000 downloads so far. And
Although I
launched
think we have
last
70,000
year.
new engineering jobs every year in the United States, every single year. So that's kind of a drop in the bucket. But guys, first I want to know that the stuff I'm hearing up here, I think the answer is in. There is no privacy. It's utterly impossible. But second, Stan, I think it's about to get far worse. And
Invest
that is because
in privacy, ladies and gentlemen. Don't look away.
of
look
the
away.
Internet of Things. The Internet of Things will start measuring everything we do everywhere we go, right?
Totally. Yeah, we're waiting for it to happen. And those devices are not being built in a secure fashion. They are easy to hack. Whether true or just apocryphal, there's the story of the refrigerator connected to the internet and being hacked by cyber criminals and used to send spam out. I mean, so again, these to me are trade-offs, because we clearly don't want that.
You have to check out Bruce the Toaster. So Bruce tweets.
Yes.
And Bruce has friends, and he's only hosted by his family. If you don't toast enough, he'll call the store and order toast. And if you're still not using him and utilizing him as Bruce feels he should be used, you should check him out. He's got a Facebook page, Bruce the Toaster.
Bruce the Toaster.
Yeah.
There you go. But it's the hackers and what
It's the
they're doing
hackers.
to take advantage of our weaknesses in technology that concern me, as well as the government and Google and the others. There's three players here, and two of the players, you can argue government, yes, they overreach. I'm old enough again, I remember Richard Nixon talk about overreach. And frankly, you know, my attitude towards more recent presidents is no different. But they also do something rather good for us. They do work to protect the national defense. With Amazon, yes, they collect all this information, but they give us something back. I've found a number of books that I would not have known about had Google not told me, you read this, you might like that. With cyber criminals, there's no good side to that. It's all down. It's all bad. And that's another player here that we've not yet even begun to talk about.
Okay, Michelle, are we now to a point where there is an obligation on the part of tech companies to keep all of our data so that government can snoop through it? There's an app, the Burner app, lets you kind of have a temporary phone number and burn it. And I talked to the CEO of the company. They don't even keep your data on their own server, so that when you have a bug in your phone and your source list gets wiped out, your contacts, they can't restore it for you because they don't even have a copy. Is that almost, are tech companies going to get in trouble with the feds for not keeping our data?
Well, yes, I think is the answer, and I think it's fascinating that it's coming from Germany. So after Charlie Hebdo, the German chancellor said, we need to retain data. And I thought, including your cell phone? What do you think, Angela? Which is it? So I think right now it's a very confusing time. We don't have a lot of clarity. I think people who are being very, very conservative are saving everything, but this goes back to the very beginning of what I was talking about. When you are curating your data that makes you money, and getting rid of data that will cause you liability, the stuff that's sitting like in a hoarder's closet, then you are running a healthy data balance sheet, and you can get rid of data just as after the Accenture debacle, when people were shredding things in the face of litigation. If you are constantly and repetitively and judiciously getting rid of your data as you go along, it doesn't mean it's going to be perfect.
As a person or as a company?
As a company.
But the problem is companies, because storage costs are falling 30 to 40% a year.
They're not.
Hey, to have a gigabyte at Amazon's S3 cloud costs 3 cents a month. And so companies are keeping everything. Now, these figures are real. It turns out the companies, they don't need 70% of the data they keep. They never need it. Yet they're afraid to move it in the cloud because they can't get it once they get out.
Yeah, so this is
why these guys aren't doing what you're saying.
But your premise is completely wrong.
Which one?
So that storage is cheap. So just because I own a Fitbit doesn't mean that my ass is not fat. You are saying that just because it's cheap to buy technology, that it's cheap to own, curate, and then be the fiduciary of data.
I'm saying they no longer have a motive to do all the trimming you're talking about because they don't need to.
The Europeans are coming up with a law that will be finally enacted in the next 12 months that says potential 5% of global turnover for a business that fails to protect information. That is some expensive storage. So for me to have a potential breach of something that brings me no value for customers that haven't even interacted with me for 10 years, because I say that is cheap because the technology is cheap, is like saying let's not have electricity because my light switch is too expensive.
Okay.
But the other thing about your assumption, Dennis, that the companies have to do this because they have to be afraid that the government is going to be angry at them if they don't preserve all the information. There's a law that's called the Communications Assistance and Law Enforcement Act, and it does place obligations on private companies, but I think you were exactly right in using the word should, because the question is, should we all have any opportunity at all to use encryption or to keep things from the government, because it's the same problem. If I have encryption that the government cannot break, then it's the same thing as the company throwing away the data. Right after the Patriot Act was passed, when the librarians around the country discovered that the FBI could come into the libraries and ask for records, librarians just started shredding their records at the end of the day. And nobody was going to punish them for keeping it. So the real question, Dennis, is whether there's going to be a law that punishes companies for not retaining data.
Okay, Susan Graham, we just heard Susan Herman talk about encryption the government can't break. I could swear I just read a story yesterday, the day before, that said, the computers are getting so powerful that eventually, soon, there will be no encryption that they can't break. What do you say as the computer scientist on the panel?
I wouldn't say soon, not at all. I mean, there are ideas in the research community that would change the nature of encryption. I don't think that would mean that encryption was no longer a viable technology. In my view, they're years off.
And yet, Michelle, I heard a machine learning expert say on a panel yesterday that we're very close, maybe 10 years before computers are smarter than us and better than us at doing almost everything except playing the violin. And then he said, but the thing is when they get to that point, then within 10 years from that, they're going to be 15,000 times as good as humans. I mean, isn't encryption really not the right answer, Michelle?
Encryption is a great tool, but it's only a tool. I think once we figure out and free ourselves from the technology discussion, which is an odd thing for a technology company to say, once we look at data, what does it do? How does it harm? How are we looking at it on a balance sheet? It is the most important global currency. We don't have informatics, so we don't have infonomics yet, economists that only care about that stuff. Then we figure out how do we segment pieces and how do we virtualize other pieces? How do you, if you can break encryption, why don't we give one piece that doesn't make sense without the other piece? There's lots of different ways of solving. Once you ask the right questions, technology can help you solve.
Okay.
That's
Stan,
critical.
would a lot of the controversy, though, just fall away if companies simply paid me for my privacy? For example, when I walk into the Rite Aid in Brooklyn and I use that frequent buyer card that tells them all about my purchases, my gosh, you get 20 and 30% discounts. I mean, on a $40 bill to say like $12 or something, I'm just astounded by that, and it's worth it. Plus, I'm using the card with the old wireline number of my ex-wife, so they don't even know that it's me. It's, you know, so, but that seems like violating my privacy if I'm willing to sell it.
Yeah, and I think this goes to the question of the informed consumer, because okay, you want 20%, but do you really know what the implications? Do you understand the implications of the information you're giving to Rite Aid? How are they going to use it? Some of it they'll use benignly to, oh, you bought this, you might want to buy that. But included in there is a lot of electronic protected health information. We just saw the Anthem breach, 70 million identities stolen. Rite Aid, your information you just gave away for 20% that can come back to have you result in your medical insurance being no longer available to you. Did you really take that into account when you took this 20%?
Right. Susan, as you campaign and crusade for privacy rights and things like that, is there any little tiny voice inside you that ever kind of admits to yourself, you know, I'm kind of making a bigger deal out of this than it really is? Because for the vast hundreds of millions of Americans, they're never going to be affected by this in any way at all. And I'm kind of rabble-rousing here, but the problem's a little overstated.
Well, I don't have that little voice because I don't think it's overstated. One of my colleagues said that the reason Americans don't care about privacy is that we have it. And you talk to people, I was talking to Ariel Dorfman, the playwright and poet from Chile, who said he cannot believe that Americans have conversations about who cares about privacy. He said that's what happened in Chile. That's how they got a dictatorship. So I think, you know, it's vital that we care about privacy, and again, especially as against the government. But I want to get back to what Stan was saying too about this consent idea, because one thing you hear a lot, which I think goes into the little voices that some people get, is that privacy is an outmoded context, and you talk to young people, and they will all tell you that they don't care about privacy.
They're exhibitionists.
They post things on Facebook, and they don't care what people know about them,
Yeah.
and that's the new world, and I should get over it. I'm just old, and it's an ancient
And
value.
then we pass a law in California saying, oh, you can remove a post if you put something up you regret. And in Europe, they're doing that thing, which I think is kind of, how about you take responsibility for what you post?
But I think some of it is that young people are young, but I think it stands concept of what do we mean by consent. So I think a lot of young people are not mature enough to know that what they post is going to follow them forever. But I think that it's also not true that young people don't care about privacy. They think they have control, and they care a lot if somebody seizes information about them that they have not put out there.
Right.
So I don't think it's true that privacy is an outdated concept.
Right. But I think notice and consent is a broken concept. I don't. I mean, that was what I was trying to say at the beginning, that we make these decisions constantly, multiple times a day, and they're trade-offs between the benefit and the risk.
Right.
And we don't understand we're making them half the time, and we don't know how to make them.
I guess-
and that's why I think putting the burden on the individual, which is what notice and consent does, doesn't work anymore.
I guess it's because when we started, if you wanted to have a telephone, you would have to pay extra to not have your number listed in that white page as publicly available. And then when we got an Amex card, you decided, well, to avoid having to show ID and all that stuff, you know, I'll go ahead and let them have my name and address. It's just that when we started doing that 30 years ago, that wasn't so much of the data set. But now the data set, when you agree to do things like that, is just vastly richer and deeper and far more revealing. But again, I don't know how many examples we have, and you would be good at this, of true, just regular, innocent Americans whose privacy was violated by technologists and government, and it really ruined their life. Do you have any examples? You got to show, not tell.
Well, I do have some. I can show you the book I wrote, which is about the impact of the war on terror on ordinary Americans.
And you have ordinary Americans in there?
I have
with things
ordinary
that happen?
Americans. I have people to whom things have happened. But the greater problem is that most of my stories are not so much about surveillance, because the problem with covert surveillance is when the government secretly has information on you, you don't know it. And if the government does put you on a no-fly list, or audits your tax return, or you suddenly get arrested for tax evasion, you don't know, how they got there and what they were looking at. So there, in fact, is a very great impact of the government knowing all these things.
Well, give us one nugget on a guy who got hurt in your book. Give us one little thing. There's this guy who...
About the privacy, well, yeah, I have great examples about the TSA. And this, I think, goes to the whole idea that most people will try to use power responsibly, and some will abuse it. I have a story in here about a college student at Pomona College who lived in Philadelphia, and he was 20 years old at the time. This is 5 years ago. And he was stopped at the airport, and what he had in his carry-on bag were Arabic English flashcards, because he had decided to study Arabic because he was so interested in the sort of post 9/11 world. And the TSA agent said to him, "Do you know who did 9/11?" And he'd been 11 years old at the time. He said, "You mean Osama bin Laden?" And the agent said to him, "Yeah, do you know what language he spoke?" And the person said, "You mean Arabic?" And he said, "Yes, do you see why these cards are suspicious?" Now, this would be funny, except this kid spent 5 hours in a back room at the Philadelphia airport being interrogated, terrified by Philadelphia police officers who were being better safe than sorry, and missed his plane, and ended up with a lawsuit, which I'm happy to say the ACLU of Pennsylvania has now won for him. They won him damages. So that's an example. I think we don't really know. The Inspector General reports for the different agencies, I think, are very good examples of there have been abuses. With the national security letters, it turns out that the FBI had their own regulations that they were supposed to be following. They violated them on thousands of occasions. They were, when it's all behind closed doors, it's very hard to establish.
So I've got a private company violation, not my own, thankfully. But just a quick story. This is where privacy really hits the road. So a neighbor of mine took his young daughter, who's diabetic. Unfortunately, they're kind of frequent flyers in the emergency room. They show up. They're met. They call. They said, "We're having an episode. We're on our way." They're met at the door by Child Protective Services. He is separated from a 6-year-old child who is now terrified, in shock, having an insulin incident, and he is being interviewed, and she's being interviewed for abuse. Turns out someone had stolen her ID to get health care, and that someone had drugs in their system and alcohol in their system. And so the question was, why are you abusing your 6-year-old child with these kind of medicaments? And so the story is bad enough there, and you kind of think, well, at least someone's watching out for kids. That's good, right? They're reunited. And then he says to the doctor, "How do I get this off the file?" The doctor says, "I can't because of HIPAA. I have to keep this on the books as something that's part of her medical records, but I'll add a note." So we helped him out. It's not on her record anymore, but how many people happen to have a CPO in their life that goes batshit crazy when they hurt kids?
Yeah.
I've used a bad word a few times. I apologize.
We're getting ready to move into the final. We're getting ready to move into the final phase here in a little dismount. And what's going to happen is we're going to then need a question or two from the audience. Now, if no one here asks the question, I will hunt each one of you down and confront you. So be ready for a question, please. But now, what about fixing it? Could each of you come up with just 1 or 2 quick solutions that you think would help fix this in some way, or at least curb the incursions? Susan, you start us off.
Okay, if you could give me slide number 7. As it happens, the provision of the Patriot Act, which unleashed all the metadata surveillance, Section 215, sunsets on June 1st. So if you don't know, there's the acronym for the USA Patriot Act. The actual title of the act is Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism. One thing that the Congress is considering now is called the USA Freedom Act, and you can see the staffer made up an acronym for that too. Uniting and Strengthening America by Fulfilling Rights and Ending Eavesdropping, Dragnet Collection, and Online Monitoring. So, I actually met the guy who said he did it over a couple of beers and it took him hours to come up with that. But that is pending, and there are a number of other possibilities that Congress is now considering. If they don't renew Section 215, which is what gives them authority for this bulk collection on June 1st, it will expire. Would that be a bad thing? We really don't know. All of the evidence when the NSA directors were telling us that they'd caught all these terrorists, it turned out that when they went back to find out what number was defensible, it turned out the number of terrorist incidents that might have been prevented because of bulk monitoring was 1, and they probably could have gotten the evidence some other way. So again, that's not saying there are never benefits, but it is not true that there's only benefits and no costs. And I think that if you are at all concerned about this, find out where your congressional representative is on the renewal of the Patriot Act provision before June 1st, and tell them what you think, whatever it is.
Okay, and Stan,
So
we
it's-
make a big mistake if we don't renew Patriot, don't we?
We've got to find the balance. Critical is finding the balance on the one side. And on the other is as well, I think it goes back to what I said earlier. Consumers have got to be brought into the dialogue. They're unfortunately not yet adequately present. I mean, your story, just a good example of that. The initial HIPAA violation was probably a cyber theft, right? So we've got to do a better job of protecting that information that we have. But we've also got to raise awareness, education of the consumers, and we've got to provide the consumers with technology tools so that they're not just clicking right through those, do you consent, but in fact, they're taking responsibility. We're providing responsibility to the consumers so that they can make good, rational judgments that are right for them in whatever circumstances those are. That's
Okay.
part dialogue, that's part technology as well.
Susan?
So I think accountability and auditability are very important technical components. Michelle made a comment about this information that got into the wrong medical record. There is technology that exists now that would tell us how it got there, who put it there, and therefore we could easily have processes to remove it again.
Yep. If you monitored and maintained information.
Yeah.
So
Which is technologically possible,
Yes.
but not.
But there's our balance again.
And it's not legally required.
and it's not legally required. So I think the two-word answer is I think privacy engineering. And it is something, and it does take at least 10 years. It probably will continue to take the next generation. Most of our engineers that are graduating from even the top schools are not required to take security. And there's only one program I know of, well, two. So Johns Hopkins is launching, and I've just taught my first class in privacy engineering at Carnegie Mellon. We need privacy engineering classwork so that people know how to drive real-time requirements, specifications, and quality features that are measurable. Once you can measure things, you start to do all sorts of interesting things within a company. You're now talking to the CFO, who tends to run things.
Now, what about a faster fix? Is it possible to get off the grid? Is it possible to turn off your phone, to use cash, to stop using credit cards, and honestly now I'm not tracked? What do you say, Susan, scientist?
You brought up cameras.
Oh yeah, there's that problem. Anyone else?
Can
Getting
wear
off the grid?
A foil bodysuit.
Why do you want to, with all the grid has to offer?
That's true. See, that's the problem, is that you guys keep saying we've got to arm consumers and give them these new rights, but when you're looking for something and up comes, hey, do you agree? I mean, if I say no, then I'm not going to get what I want, and we want what we want. So I wonder, even if we give consumers those tools,
But you're
they won't use
violating
them.
the definition of privacy, which is the
Right.
authorized processing of data. If I'm
Yes.
authorizing you to share with me, privacy, particularly in the large bulk sense, is not secrecy. Privacy is sharing. There's more about sharing in privacy and fiduciary rights of care than there is in secrecy.
Is not secrecy. Privacy is about sharing?
Absolutely.
Does anyone else here agree with that? Or
I think that privacy is about your control of whether you share. Does anybody watch John Oliver?
Of
He had an
course.
interview with Edward Snowden where it turned out that what most people cared about was not whether somebody else knew their data, but for people who did sexting, they were very concerned. People were outraged by the idea that the government might have someplace in the data
Well,
bank
bingo.
a picture of their genitals.
hence the Google search and what people are searching for. All right. Anybody got last dismount wrap up thoughts here? You want to get out there before I ask for questions? Hint, hint.
Let me say one more thing about the law, because in terms of where we are on all this privacy stuff, the last time that Congress amended the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, which is all of our law about all this, was 1986. Now, have there been any developments in
time
electronic
with history.
privacy since 1986?
Oh, I
I
can't
think
even
my
believe
10-year
that.
code looks pretty good now, doesn't
And,
it?
and Congress loves to pass laws, so I can't believe they didn't swarm all over this with all kinds of new laws. Anybody else got anything?
Just to piggyback on what you just said, Susan, we have a Congress and a Senate that is just abysmally ignorant of all of this technology. We've got senators who don't do email. Like, that's ludicrous. This is 2015. Come on,
Yes.
get with it. You know?
Yes.
They're
Okay.
trying to get off the grid.
Yeah, there you go. Well, I think
Except
there's
for
a
the
real
donors.
prominent politician who did an awfully good job of getting off that grid and deleting 30,000 emails while she was Secretary of State. So there's a way of going about it. Do we have any questions? Oh, I'm so happy. Okay, first, go ahead.
my question is something that is close to my heart. I mentor some young people, a number of whom have been in trouble with the law. And they are turning their lives around and doing a great job. And their records will be expunged, which should mean they should be able to go look for a job and their record's been expunged, they're okay. Except when they got arrested, the little local paper wrote about it, or the LA Times wrote about it, or whomever. That record is there forever. So they go with their expunged record and some education, and you go for a job, and everything's looking great until they Google your name. So you see the point. There's also a lot of small organizations. You go to a dinner, you go to whatever, they take your picture, they stick it up on their website. Maybe you don't want your employer to know what political party you're in or what church you belong to. These organizations don't take you down. So on that very small day-to-day, how are people being harmed level that's not by our government, but by our, fellow community, is there any solution for that?
SEO,
Unless it's not a problem.
search engine optimization. I mean, doesn't that allow you to kind of bury the bad stuff and play up the good stuff? I mean, isn't there a way to just counteract that with other tech?
Well, this is such a tricky topic. So this is the whole right to be forgotten, which of course has never existed in mankind. So we've always known. I grew up in a really small town. Like, I've been out for 35 years. They know more about me than anybody. Like, just based on where I lived and who my family was, et cetera. This is a good case where that would be a good right. I think mugshots of domestic abuse survivors, police come, they see weapons, they see drugs, they take everyone in, everyone gets a mugshot. The person, who's the victim of abuse, often women, has a mugshot, same thing. She gets out of the relationships, turns up. So those are corner cases. The problem I have with the right to be forgotten is as a peanut butter effort, didn't we learn anything from the Spanish Inquisition? Didn't we learn anything from the social cleansing that we tried to do in Asia? Like, if any right that is applied, as a sickle across society's information as a censorship tool, I think is problematic. So I think we will get to a much more nuanced sense of the right to be forgotten, whether it's going to come from government as a cram down from Europe first, or whether a company like Google is going to come up with its own policies and sensibilities. There is work being done in that space, but it's a really critical issue.
Okay, thank you for breaking the ice and asking that question. We have another question? Yes, sir.
Thank you all. Is this working? Okay, thank you for taking questions. And my question is for Susan of the ACLU, and this is with regard to the upcoming renewal of the Patriot Act. What is your guess or your prediction on what's going to happen with that, and what provisions will be renewed and which ones won't?
Okay, on what's going to happen with the Patriot Act. The original Patriot Act in 2001 was passed about 6 weeks after 9/11. And it's not surprising that we had, I think, an overreaction at the time, because the act, you saw the hubris in the act. We knew exactly what we needed to do before we knew what happened on 9/11 itself. So I fault Congress for not having revisited whether we're doing the right things. So initially they had 16 provisions that sunsetted after 4 years. Then they kept almost all of them, and there were only 4 that sunset, and the Section 215 is one of the only remaining provisions that has not yet been made permanent. I think it's unlikely that Congress is going to do more than very slight tinkering around the edges, and I think that is because Stan was saying they don't know a lot about the technology. But I think what's more important is that what they hear from people is better be safe than sorry. Why should I care? It doesn't do any harm. Why not collect all the information?
And if I vote in Congress in favor of not renewing the Patriot Act, and there's a terror attack a month later, my career is dead, and what politicians need is to be reelected.
But I think the 9/11 Commission said that when they did the actual study of what had happened on 9/11, they said that presidents and politicians should stop telling us that they can keep us safe, because they can't. Yeah, and the initial algorithms that were trying to find terrorists were trying to find people who replicated in exact detail 9/11.
Okay.
And things have gone beyond that. It is not possible for anybody to promise to keep us safe, unfortunately.
And I think
Okay, we
fewer
might have
people
time
read
for
that
one
report
more-
than
oh.
my book.
Go ahead.
I absolutely agree. Security, the new normal is we are not secure. We can't build secure systems. We can
Yeah.
do the best we can, but there's always going to be vulnerabilities in those
Well,
systems.
thank you for that encouraging thought, sir.
Absolutely,
We have time
happy
for
to
one
help.
more question. Yes, sir?
My understanding is the last time they did the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, they included a court that I guess was designed to protect American citizens from our government without due process, looking at those records you talked about, those telephone. Has that system worked?
Well, many Americans, in fact, have had their communications looked at under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act because, again, the post-9/11 amendments allow the government to look at the contents of conversations by email, Skype, telephone, whatever, with somebody overseas. So as long as the target is somebody who believed to be, sometimes there are mistakes, but if the target is believed to be a non-American not living in the United States, the government can listen to the conversation, and guess what? There's always a second party on that conversation. So many Americans are having their conversations monitored. Dennis, you wanted a funny story about someone who had his life ruined. Brandon Mayfield, a lawyer in Portland, Oregon, who was suspected of the train bombing in Spain because the FBI totally messed up identifying his fingerprints where the Spaniards got it right. The FBI was doing surveillance under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of the Mayfield household. They gathered up everything, including Brandon's children's Spanish homework, and they put it in a folder labeled Spanish documents. They refused to take them out of the government data bank even after it became perfectly apparent that Brandon was innocent, the government had apologized, etc. They're probably still there.
Yes,
Imagine the
because of
note
the
that went to the
technology.
teacher that next day. The dog ate my homework. Now the feds took my homework.
Right. Okay. Now, thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to close with one quick thought. There was this legendary CEO of Cap Cities ABC, Thomas Murphy. And I remember as a young reporter at the Journal, he said something to me I never forgot. And he said, what I tell all my managers and what we try to tell our rank and file is basically in terms of your personal behavior when you're not at work, you shouldn't be doing anything that you're not comfortable having written about on the front page of your hometown newspaper. And that advice so long ago in the mid-1980s, I think holds truer today than ever before for privacy. You got to watch your own behavior because nothing you do is going to go undetected. So we better get comfortable with that. I think these guys were great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.